Everyone waited for cake and smiles. Silver balloons floated against the ceiling of Harborview Grand Hall in Evanston, Illinois, glowing softly under warm chandelier light. A three-tier vanilla cake trimmed with white roses stood at the center table, and behind it a banner read Happy 46th Birthday, Jonathan. Guests laughed, phones were raised, and soft jazz played in the background. But Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't clap. He didn't even look at the cake. He didn't look at me either. And in that silence, the kind no one else notices, he hid the reason for my revenge. Before you judge me, before you assume this is just another angry wife story, listen carefully. What happened that night didn't begin with balloons or candles. It began 3 months earlier with a bank alert and a truth that cost me $492,000. Stay with me. You'll understand why I stayed calm, why I didn't confront him, and why I waited. My name is Naomi Brooks. I was 43 years old in February 2023, and I had been married to Jonathan Brooks for 18 years. We lived in a 5-bedroom colonial home in Wilmette, Illinois, valued at $1.35 million, fully paid off, not because of Jonathan, but because of me. I was a commercial property consultant and small-scale real estate investor earning roughly $195,000 a year. Jonathan worked as a senior operations manager for a shipping firm, earning close to $102,000 annually. People said we were successful. What they didn't know is that every ounce of stability in our life had been built quietly by me. Jonathan wasn't abusive. He wasn't loud. He was distant in a way that felt harmless until it wasn't. He forgot birthdays, but remembered office deadlines. He praised my independence the way people praise a machine that never breaks. For years, I told myself this was marriage, until the money started moving without me. On November 28, 2022, at 9:52 a.m., I was reviewing lease documents for a mixed-use property in Oak Park, when my phone vibrated. A notification from Bank of America Private Wealth confirmed a transfer of $30,000 from our joint investment account. I didn't panic. Jonathan and I shared that account. But 7 minutes later, another alert arrived. Then another. By 10:11 a.m., a total of $85,000 had been transferred to an entity called Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC. I had never heard that name in my life. I called Jonathan. No answer. I texted him asking if he had moved money that morning. The message was read. There was no reply. By noon, the total had climbed to $140,000, and something settled in my chest, not fear, but certainty. This wasn't a mistake. Jonathan came home that evening at 6:38 p.m., loosened his tie, and kissed my cheek like always. He told me I looked tired. When I asked if he had transferred money that day, he nodded casually and said it was family support, and he'd explain later. His eyes avoided mine for just long enough to matter. That phrase, family support, would eventually cost me nearly $500,000. Over the next 6 weeks, the transfers continued. $45,000 on December 12th, $70,000 on January 4th, $92,000 on January 26th, always to Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC. By February 10th, 2023, the total reached $492,000, money I had reserved for 2 commercial renovations, 1 down payment, and my personal retirement cushion. Jonathan still hadn't explained anything. I didn't confront him again. I watched instead. I noticed the sudden Sunday calls to his mother, the unplanned trips to Madison, Wisconsin, the way he stiffened whenever his phone buzzed. Then, on February 14th, 2023, at 11:06 p.m., I found an email on our shared desktop. The subject line read Trust Distribution Confirmation. Finalized. It was sent from Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC. The recipients were Diane Brooks, Ethan Brooks, and Lauren Brooks, Jonathan's mother, his younger brother, and his sister. My name wasn't there. That was the moment everything changed. This wasn't theft. It was coordination. They hadn't just taken my money. They had decided together that I didn't deserve to be informed. Sitting alone in my office that night, listening to the hum of a house I had paid for, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't demand answers. I would wait. Because silence, when used with intention, becomes power. I didn't open the email again that night. I already knew enough. Instead, I forwarded it to my private address and shut the laptop at exactly 11:12 p.m. Jonathan was asleep beside me, breathing slowly, comfortably, the way people sleep when they believe nothing can touch them. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, not counting hours but numbers, balances, liabilities, exit points. This wasn't heartbreak yet. This was strategy. By 7:10 a.m. the next morning, Jonathan was already dressed for work. He poured coffee, kissed my forehead, and said he had meetings all day. I smiled and told him to be careful driving. The smile wasn't forced. It came easily once I understood that they believed I was unaware. At 9:45 a.m., I parked outside a glass office building on Davis Street in Evanston and rode the elevator to the fifth floor, where Henderson and Pike LLP occupied a quiet corner suite. I had worked with them once during a zoning dispute years earlier. I requested Marissa Henderson, an attorney known for handling marital finance disputes without noise. The consultation lasted 90 minutes and cost me $1,350, paid from my personal savings account. I remember the exact amount because it was the first time in years I had spent money without explaining it to anyone. Marissa didn't interrupt while I spoke. She asked only for facts, dates, account numbers, dollar amounts. When I showed her the email from Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC, she leaned back in her chair and nodded slowly. This wasn't reactive, she said. It was structured. She pulled public records on her screen and showed me that the trust had been registered in Dane County, Wisconsin, in October 2022, 2 weeks after Jonathan and I had liquidated a small retail property in Skokie. The timing mattered more than the amount. They were waiting for liquidity, she said. And they moved fast. Driving home, I felt something shift. Not anger. Focus. Marissa explained that because the money originated from a joint account largely funded by me, I had leverage, but only if I stayed quiet. Any confrontation could give them time to protect themselves. Silence, she said, was my advantage. For the next 2 weeks, I observed my life from a distance. Jonathan's routines became patterns. Sunday night calls to Diane Brooks at exactly 7:30 p.m. texts from Ethan Brooks just after midnight. Lauren Brooks suddenly asking me about tax shelters she claimed to be curious about. They weren't careful because they didn't think they needed to be. On March 2nd, 2023, Jonathan mentioned his birthday dinner. Mom wants to do something small, he said casually. Just family and a few friends. I agreed immediately. That night at 10:58 p.m., I logged into the joint account and confirmed what Marissa had predicted. The balance was nearly zero. The trust wasn't holding the money anymore. It was distributing it. 2 days later, Marissa filed a financial preservation notice tied to my personal assets. It didn't accuse Jonathan. It didn't notify his family. It simply froze what remained connected to my name. Jonathan didn't notice. But someone else did. On March 6th at 6:24 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID read Diane Brooks. She had never called me directly before. Her voice was polite, tight around the edges. She said there seemed to be confusion regarding recent transactions and that Jonathan believed I might be handling some paperwork. I asked calmly what paperwork she meant. There was a pause long enough to tell me everything. She said the family trust. I told her I wasn't familiar with any trust. We ended the call quickly. She never called again. That night, Jonathan came home late. He paced the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, pretending to read messages. I watched him from the table, noting the tension in his jaw. When I asked if everything was okay, he said work was stressful. I nodded and returned to my laptop, where I was filing paperwork to create Naomi Monroe Holdings LLC using my maiden name. The filing fee was $395. I paid it without hesitation. By March 18th, I had transferred 2 of my remaining properties into the new entity. By March 25th, I had opened separate banking accounts solely in my name. Each move was legal, documented, and quiet. Jonathan noticed my distance, but mistook it for distraction. "You've been busy lately," he said once. I smiled and told him it was spring planning. The birthday dinner was scheduled for April 29th at Harborview Grand Hall in Evanston. Diane handled the guest list. Lauren chose the cake. Ethan arranged the music. Jonathan did nothing but agree. That should have bothered me years ago. Now it worked in my favor. By the time the invitations went out, I knew exactly how much money they had taken, where it had gone, and how vulnerable the structure was. I also knew something they didn't. Silence had made them careless. And carelessness, when documented properly, turns into leverage. As the date drew closer, I practiced calm. I chose my dress carefully, a slate blue silk sheath that suggested stability, not drama. I approved the cake without comment. I smiled at every planning call. They thought the night was about celebration. They didn't know it was about exposure. By the week of the dinner, Jonathan had started watching me more closely. Not with suspicion exactly, but with uncertainty. On April 24th, 2023, he asked if I was excited about his birthday. I told him I was. It wasn't a lie. I just hadn't told him what kind of excitement it was. On April 26th, 3 days before the event, Marissa called me at 2:17 p.m. Her voice was calm, professional. She told me the financial preservation notice had triggered a back-end alert at one of the banks connected to Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC. Nothing had been frozen on their side yet, but someone had noticed. "They'll start asking questions," she said. "Let them." She reminded me not to change my behavior. Not now. That night, Jonathan mentioned his mother again. "She's been stressed," he said casually while scrolling through his phone. Something about paperwork. I nodded sympathetically and poured him more tea. The word paperwork tasted different in my mouth now. On April 27th, I received an email confirmation from Harborview Grand Hall detailing the final invoice. The total cost of the dinner was $14,860, including catering, music, decor, and service staff. The payment receipt showed my name and card. I had insisted on that. If they were going to celebrate using my money, it would be properly documented. The morning of April 29th, I woke before my alarm. It was 6:03 a.m., and the house was quiet. Jonathan was still asleep. I stood in the kitchen, looking around at the space I had paid for, the art I had chosen, the silence I had maintained. This wasn't grief. It was clarity. At 9:30 a.m., Marissa sent me a single-line message. "Everything is in place." No emojis. No reassurance. She didn't need to say more. Jonathan left the house at noon to run a few errands. I knew from the location data on our shared calendar that he was meeting his brother Ethan in Skokie. I didn't follow up. I didn't ask questions. That was no longer my role. I arrived at Harborview Grand Hall at 6:12 p.m., 20 minutes before the guests. The staff greeted me by name. I checked the seating arrangement one last time. Diane Brooks was at the head table, beside Jonathan. Ethan and Lauren were close enough to hear every word. I was placed slightly to Jonathan's left, close enough to be seen, far enough to be underestimated. Guests began arriving at 6:30. Smiles, hugs, polite compliments. People told Jonathan he looked great for 46. He laughed a little too loudly. His phone buzzed twice during the first 10 minutes. He checked it quickly and put it away. Dinner was served at 7:15. The speeches began at 7:48. Diane spoke first. She thanked everyone for coming and talked about family, loyalty, and support. She said Jonathan had always been the backbone of their family. I watched her hands as she spoke. They trembled slightly when she lifted her glass. At 8:05, Lauren stood and joked about how lucky Jonathan was to have such a supportive wife. The word supportive landed like a challenge. Ethan followed, clapping Jonathan on the back, talking about how family always takes care of each other. No one mentioned me directly after that. At 8:22, the cake was rolled out. Cameras came up. The violinist paused. Someone shouted for Jonathan to make a wish. That was when I noticed the silence again. Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't lean toward the cake. His eyes moved briefly to Diane, then to Ethan, then back to his phone, which he had placed face down on the table. I reached into my clutch and felt the edge of the envelope inside. Thick paper. Clean folds. Copies, not originals. I had chosen that deliberately. At 8:24, Jonathan's phone vibrated again. This time, he didn't ignore it. He glanced down, and the color drained from his face. It was subtle, but I saw it. So did his mother. I leaned closer to him and spoke quietly, my voice calm enough not to carry. "You should check that," I said. "It looks important." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. For the first time in months, there was uncertainty in his eyes. At 8:26, before he could respond, I stood up. I lifted my glass. The room quieted. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Phones rose again, expecting a toast. They thought this was the moment for gratitude. They didn't know it was the moment for truth. I didn't raise my voice when I began to speak. I didn't need to. The room was already listening. I said Jonathan's name first, slow and steady, the way you say it when you want someone to feel seen. I wished him a happy birthday and thanked everyone for coming. I spoke about 18 years of marriage, about shared homes and shared dreams. I said I believed birthdays were moments of honesty, not performance. I felt Jonathan stiffen beside me. I paused, just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then I said I wanted to share something I had learned recently, because honesty deserved witnesses. I reached into my clutch and placed the envelope on the table in front of me. I didn't open it yet. I let it exist. I explained that over the past few months, a significant amount of money had been moved from accounts in my name without my consent. I gave the number clearly, $492,000, and watched the room react. Some guests looked at Jonathan, others at Diane. No one spoke. Jonathan tried to laugh. It came out wrong. He said this wasn't the time. I smiled at him and said timing was exactly the point. I reminded him that family had always been important to him, that he had said trust mattered more than anything else. Then I opened the envelope. I didn't read from it. I laid the copies out one by one: bank transfer confirmations, trust registration documents, distribution summaries. I named Great Lakes Heritage Trust LLC aloud. I named the recipients. Diane's glass shook as she set it down. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Lauren stared straight ahead. I said I didn't believe in public humiliation, which was true. That's why I wasn't asking questions. I was stating facts. I said the money originated from joint accounts funded primarily by me. I said the trust had been established without my knowledge. I said legal counsel had already reviewed everything. I didn't mention Marissa's name. I didn't need to. Jonathan stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. He told me to stop. His voice was sharp now, desperate. People shifted in their seats. A server froze near the wall, unsure whether to move. I looked at Jonathan calmly and asked him a simple question. I asked when he planned to tell me. Not why, not how, when. He didn't answer. That silence, the same one from earlier, spread through the room. Diane tried to speak then. She said this was a misunderstanding, that the trust was temporary, that everything would be explained privately. I thanked her for clarifying and said that was exactly what the courts were for. At 8:41 p.m., my phone vibrated in my hand. I didn't look at it. I already knew what it was. Earlier that afternoon, Marissa had scheduled the delivery of a formal notice to Jonathan's work email and his personal account. The timing wasn't accidental. Silence had done its job. Now structure was taking over. I told the room that I loved birthdays because they marked time honestly. They reminded us who we had been and who we had chosen to become. I said I hoped Jonathan's 46th year would bring him clarity. Then I wished everyone a safe drive home. I sat down. No one clapped. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. This time, he picked it up. His shoulders sagged as he read. Diane reached for his arm, whispering urgently. Ethan stood and said they should leave. Lauren looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, she seemed unsure whether I was the villain or the warning. I remained seated until the room began to empty. I thanked the staff. I signed the final receipt. The cake was never cut. At 9:12 p.m., I stepped outside into the cool Evanston air. The night was quiet, clean. My phone rang. It was Marissa. "It's done," she said. I closed my eyes, not in relief, but in recognition. This wasn't the end. It was the shift. I didn't sleep that night. I walked around my apartment in Lincoln Park, looking out at the quiet streets and the soft shimmer of the lake in the distance. The city felt calm, almost indifferent, while my mind raced with possibilities. Jonathan had received the notice, the proof of the trust, the evidence of his missteps. I imagined him staring at his laptop, unsure if the walls of his carefully curated life were crumbling, or if he could somehow rebuild them before anyone noticed the cracks. By morning, the messages started coming in. Friends, distant relatives, even colleagues of Jonathan's family. Some asked questions. Some offered condolences. Most didn't know what to say. The silence from last night had transformed into a whisper of curiosity that traveled faster than any of us could anticipate. I ignored them all. Today wasn't about their reactions. Today was about timing. I had scheduled a private meeting with my lawyer, Rebecca Shaw, at 10 a.m. She had been instrumental in organizing the legal maneuvers that made last night possible. Her office smelled faintly of coffee and paper. She smiled when I walked in, almost knowingly, and said, "Everything went as planned?" I nodded. I didn't elaborate. Some victories were better savored in silence. Rebecca spread out the documents again on the polished oak table. I watched her hands move with precision. She noted that Jonathan's attempts to reverse the trust would be complicated. There were witnesses, notarized statements, and deadlines that couldn't be ignored. I reminded her that my goal wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty, it was about justice. Still, she raised an eyebrow at my calmness. "You're patient," she said. "More patient than most people would be at a birthday party." I smiled. Patience had been my weapon all along. At 11:47 a.m., I received a call from an unknown number. It was Lauren, Jonathan's daughter. Her voice trembled. I don't understand," she said. "Why would my dad do this?" I chose my words carefully. I told her that sometimes adults make choices they think are clever, but those choices have consequences. I didn't accuse. I didn't justify. I simply stated a truth she needed to hear. By the time the call ended, I could hear the tears in her room, the silence in hers that mirrored Jonathan's. By 1:30 p.m., I had returned home, unpacked a briefcase of documents, and reviewed every financial statement one more time. $492,000. Confirmed. Documented. Irrefutable. I smiled to myself, not because I enjoyed the number, but because it represented clarity. For too long, Jonathan had assumed he could manipulate the system, bend trust, and escape accountability. Tonight, he would understand otherwise. Around 3:15 p.m., Diane called. Her tone was brisk, measured, almost like she was trying to reestablish authority. She spoke of family dynamics and misunderstandings as if those words could erase months of secrecy and deceit. I thanked her politely and reminded her that honesty could not be negotiated. She didn't argue further, which was telling. The room at the birthday party had emptied, but the echoes of last night's revelation were still traveling. By evening, I allowed myself a brief moment of quiet reflection. I poured a glass of wine and looked out at the city skyline. The wind coming off Lake Michigan carried a sense of renewal. I realized that revenge was never about spectacle. It was about reclaiming power and asserting truth. I had done that silently, effectively, and with precision. But I also knew this was only the beginning. Jonathan's world was shifting. And when people's worlds shift, so do their priorities. At 7:04 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time, it was Ethan, Jonathan's eldest son. His voice was defensive, almost hostile. "You've gone too far," he said. "You don't understand family loyalty." I let him speak. Then, calmly, I told him that loyalty is earned, not assumed. And that betrayal, when left unchecked, would always come to light. There was a pause, a hesitation, then a click. I knew the next steps would be messy. But that was okay. The pieces were in motion, the dominoes lined up. And as the night settled over Lincoln Park, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited, watched, and acted with deliberate intent. Everyone had their part to play, and I had played mine perfectly. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of my apartment in Lincoln Park. I sat at the edge of my sofa, notebook open, pen in hand, planning my next move. The silence of the city felt different now, charged, expectant, almost aware of the chaos about to ripple through Jonathan's world. I could almost hear the echoes of last night's revelations bouncing through his mansion in Wicker Park. The thought made me smile faintly, but I reminded myself to stay calm. Patience had always been my greatest ally. At 9:12 a.m., my phone rang. It was a private investigator I had hired months ago, Marcus Trent. "I've got updates," he said, his voice low and precise. He relayed the movements of Jonathan's associates, financial advisors scrambling, family friends whispering, all slowly piecing together the implications of last night's events. Marcus' meticulous attention to detail ensured that nothing escaped my notice. "He's confused," Marcus noted. "He doesn't know what's coming, and his usual tricks aren't working." I let the words sink in. That confusion was exactly what I needed. By 11 a.m., I was on my laptop, reviewing the latest bank statements and property deeds one more time. There it was $492,000 moved, verified, documented. And that was only the beginning. I had anticipated every contingency, planned for every countermeasure Jonathan could attempt. My lawyer, Rebecca, had confirmed that any attempt to reverse the trust would be futile without serious legal consequences. Justice was structured, precise, and now inevitable. At 1:30 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lauren, Jonathan's daughter. Her voice was quieter, more hesitant than yesterday. I don't know what to think," she admitted. "It's like the world has turned upside down." I spoke gently, reminding her that honesty and integrity were the only paths worth following. She paused, and I could sense her questioning everything she had assumed about her father. Some truths were painful, but they were necessary. By 3:47 p.m., I received an unexpected email from Diane, Jonathan's sister. The subject line read, "We need to talk." The tone was measured but urgent. She requested a meeting, clearly aware that the balance of power was shifting. I responded politely, scheduling a brief conversation for tomorrow morning. Each interaction, each message, was a calculated step in this carefully orchestrated plan. Around 5:15 p.m., I decided to take a short walk along the lakefront. The cold air brushed against my face, refreshing my thoughts. The calm surface of Lake Michigan mirrored the storm that was silently brewing in Jonathan's world. I thought about his family, their confusion, their frustration, their helplessness. Each reaction was a reminder of the stakes: $492,000, a legacy manipulated, and the long-awaited lesson in accountability. By evening, I returned home and poured myself a cup of tea. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. Revenge had never been about spectacle or cruelty. It had been about justice, clarity, and reclaiming the power that had been undermined for far too long. As the city lights flickered on, the buildings casting long shadows, I knew that the next phase would test both patience and resolve. The stakes had grown higher, and the dominoes were moving faster than anyone realized. At 8:20 p.m., my phone buzzed one last time for the day. It was Ethan, Jonathan's eldest son. His voice trembled with anger and confusion. "You don't understand family," he said. "This isn't right." I listened, silently letting him vent, then spoke with measured calm. "Loyalty is earned, and betrayal cannot hide forever." A long pause followed, then the call ended. I smiled faintly, knowing that the seeds of doubt had been planted firmly. As night settled over Lincoln Park, I looked out at the twinkling skyline and felt a quiet satisfaction. Everyone had a role to play. Everyone had made a choice. And the outcome, carefully orchestrated, was now unstoppable. I poured a second cup of tea, letting the warmth settle in, and waited. The story was far from over, but I was ready for the next chapter. The next morning, 7:45 a.m., I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was a message from Marcus. Jonathan left his house early. Meeting unknown. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but anticipation. Every move he made now was a calculated puzzle piece in my plan, and watching him unknowingly inch closer to the truth was intoxicating. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the quiet, knowing the storm outside my apartment windows mirrored the chaos in Jonathan's life. By 9:30 a.m., I was reviewing documents with Rebecca, my lawyer. Contracts, property deeds, bank records, it all needed one final verification. We cross-checked dates, times, and transaction histories. The total was staggering, $492,000 redirected, but the ripple effect of that money would be far greater. Jonathan thought he controlled everything, but every dollar, every line on the contract, was part of the trap I had meticulously set. "It's perfect," Rebecca said, smiling faintly. "Even he can't wiggle out of this." I nodded, feeling a chill of satisfaction. At 11:02 a.m., my doorbell rang. It was Lauren, Jonathan's daughter. She stepped in, dressed elegantly, though her expression betrayed unease. "I need to understand," she said softly. "Everything is changing so fast, and I don't know what's real anymore." We sat together in the living room, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. I explained, gently, how her father's decisions had consequences, and how sometimes people in positions of power forget that morality matters. Her eyes widened with each revelation, and I could see the seeds of doubt taking root. By 1:15 p.m., I was at my favorite cafe in River North, a quiet spot overlooking the streets below. I opened my laptop and drafted a carefully worded email to Diane, Jonathan's sister. I hinted at the evidence I had gathered, but left enough unsaid to create curiosity, tension, and anxiety. I wanted her to feel the weight of what was happening without me revealing the full picture. The thrill of controlled power surged quietly in my chest. Around 3:50 p.m., I received an unexpected text from Ethan. "You're making him look weak," he typed, his words clipped but emotional. I didn't respond immediately. Patience was crucial. Every word he sent was a confirmation that the plan was working, that confusion and fear were spreading through Jonathan's family like wildfire. By 4:30 p.m., I had traced Jonathan's movements through Marcus updates. He was visiting a bank, reviewing documents, and making calls to contacts I had anticipated. Every move predictable, every step exactly where I had hoped it would be. At 6 p.m., I returned home and poured myself a glass of wine. The sunset painted the skyline in shades of orange and purple. I allowed myself a small smile. The stakes were enormous. $492, 000, family reputations, long-held secrets exposed, but every element of this carefully constructed revenge plan had been executed perfectly. Jonathan didn't yet know that his silence would be his undoing, that each subtle glance, each hesitant conversation, was leading him closer to the revelation he could no longer avoid. By 8:10 p.m., the city had quieted down. I looked out my window, reflecting on how power and greed blinded people, even those closest to the ones they loved. I poured another glass of wine, letting the warmth calm the tension that always came before the climax of a plan. The next moves had to be precise. There was no room for error now. Every call, every email, every carefully timed action had led to this moment. The storm was approaching, and soon, Jonathan's world would shift forever. The night ended with a final text from Marcus. "Tomorrow will be decisive. Are you ready?" I typed back a single word, "always." My mind replayed every scene, every conversation, every reaction I had orchestrated. The path of revenge was not about chaos, it was about clarity, control, and justice. And as I turned off the lights, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the next chapter would tip the balance irreversibly. The next morning, 8 a.m., I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently. It was Marcus again. He's on his way to the office. Something's off. My pulse quickened. I had anticipated that today Jonathan would finally confront the cracks in his carefully built life, but seeing it unfold in real time was exhilarating. I dressed quickly, choosing an outfit that projected calm authority, a navy blazer, crisp white blouse, and gold accents, subtle yet commanding. Today, appearances mattered as much as actions. By 9:45 a.m., I was in Jonathan's neighborhood, a block away from his office. From this vantage point, I could see him enter the building, briefcase in hand, expression taut. He looked powerful, confident, but I knew the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Every move he made, every gesture, was now part of the narrative I had meticulously written. The stakes were immense: $492,000, family loyalty, pride, and reputation. I allowed myself a slow, measured smile. Control was everything. At 11:30 a.m., I received a call from Lauren. Her voice trembled. "I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart. Dad won't even look at me the same way." I comforted her softly, letting her vent, letting her realize that the person she had trusted blindly might not be who she thought. Her vulnerability was the unintentional ally in my plan. I reminded her subtly, sometimes, the truth is uncomfortable, but it shows who people really are. Each word was carefully chosen to guide her perspective without revealing my hand. By 1 p.m., I returned to my apartment to review the documents one last time. Contracts, bank statements, emails, and receipts lay in neat piles. Rebecca had confirmed everything, and the timeline was flawless. Jonathan's next steps were predictable because I had already accounted for every contingency. I poured myself a cup of coffee, letting the aroma center me, the quiet before the storm heavy in the room. Around 2:45 p.m., I got another update from Marcus. Jonathan had begun questioning his staff, asking pointed questions about missing funds, properties, and transactions. I felt a thrill of anticipation. His confusion was building. Every minute added tension. Every unanswered question heightened stakes. Jonathan's silence, once a weapon he wielded, was now a chain around him. By 4:10 p.m., I received a message from Diane. "I'm coming over. We need to talk about Jonathan." Perfect. She would now be part of the unraveling, her curiosity and concern feeding into the growing pressure on Jonathan. By 5:30 p.m., she arrived, elegantly dressed, but her eyes betraying her anxiety. We went through the documents together, her disbelief growing with each revelation. "He really did this," she whispered. I nodded, letting the weight of truth settle. At 7 p.m., I made one final move, a carefully drafted email to Jonathan himself. I didn't reveal everything, just enough to make him squirm, to realize he was being watched and his secrets were being exposed piece by piece. The stakes were now unbearable: his family, his fortune, his pride, all teetering on the edge of exposure. By 8:20 p.m., the first tremors of panic began to show, and I knew that tomorrow, everything would shift irreversibly. The night ended with me standing by the window, looking at the city lights. I allowed myself a quiet smile, savoring the precise timing, the control, the knowledge that the next day would mark a turning point. Jonathan had underestimated me, underestimated the power of calculated patience and unyielding resolve. And as I set my glass down, I whispered to myself, tomorrow, he learns the cost of silence. Morning came slowly, 6:30 a.m., with a gray light filtering through my blinds. I could feel the tension in the air, heavy and electric, like the city itself was holding its breath. Jonathan hadn't slept well, I knew because Marcus texted me. He barely touched his coffee, pacing like a caged animal. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. This was exactly the storm I had orchestrated. The stakes had never been higher. His reputation, the family's trust, and the $492,000 that was quietly slipping out of his grasp. By 8 a.m., Jonathan had called a meeting at his office. All his key staff were gathered, the energy tense, whispering behind closed doors. I watched from a distance as he attempted to regain control, but the questions I had planted, the documents subtly leaked to Diane and Marcus, had sown seeds of doubt in everyone around him. His silence was no longer commanding, it was suffocating. At 10:15 a.m., Lauren called again, voice shaky but determined. I can't believe he lied to us all this time. I feel betrayed. I listened carefully, letting her anger simmer, letting her realize the magnitude of what had been hidden. Every confession she made, every crack in her voice, was reinforcing the invisible pressure on Jonathan. Her loyalty, once unquestioned, now teetered dangerously. By 12 p.m., I returned home to prepare the next phase. I reviewed emails and notes, timing every move perfectly. Every interaction I had orchestrated over the past week had led to this moment. I dressed deliberately in muted elegance, a black sheath dress with subtle diamond studs, a reflection of my silent authority. Jonathan's world, built on arrogance and secrecy, was about to collapse, and I would witness it unfold without interference. At 2 p.m., Marcus arrived with updates. He's losing it, he said quietly. Staff are openly questioning him, and Diane is pushing harder than ever. My heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The conflict was peaking, the stakes nearly unbearable. Jonathan's pride was clashing with the reality I had constructed, and every misstep he made fed the growing suspense. By 4:30 p.m., Diane and Lauren joined me at my apartment. We went through every shred of evidence again, reviewing what Jonathan could and could not deny. Diane's shock was palpable, her voice a whisper. I didn't think he was capable of this. Not to us. I nodded solemnly, letting the weight of truth settle in the room like a tangible presence. Every revelation, every detail, tightened the invisible net around Jonathan. At 6 p.m., I sent Jonathan a subtle, taunting message. Some truths are better faced sooner than later. It was brief, calculated, and cryptic enough to make him anxious, but not enough to reveal my entire plan. The stakes were at their peak. By 8 p.m., he was visibly fraying, pacing, making phone calls that led nowhere. His silence had become his prison, his pride a liability, and the suspense unbearable. As night fell, I watched from my window again, city lights twinkling like distant stars. A quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. Each step had been deliberate, each word measured, each reaction anticipated. Tomorrow would mark the climax, the moment when Jonathan would face the consequences of his arrogance and deceit. I whispered to myself, soon, silence will no longer protect him. The morning of day 10 felt surreal, 7 a.m., like the calm before a hurricane. Jonathan hadn't slept at all. His usually immaculate office was now a mess of scattered papers and unopened envelopes, evidence of the unraveling I had set in motion. Marcus texted me almost hourly. He's losing it completely. HR is nervous. Diane's not holding back anymore. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the tension. Every moment had been meticulously planned. The confrontation, the public exposure, the $492,000 quietly reclaiming its rightful place. By 9:30 a.m., I arrived at Jonathan's office under the guise of concern, carrying documents that appeared routine but contained the critical proof of his lies. His eyes, sharp and calculating in the morning light, scanned me briefly, but he didn't suspect my calm composure hid a storm. Diane and Marcus followed discreetly, each wearing expressions of controlled fury. The conflict was tangible, the stakes, his career, wealth, and pride hanging by a fragile thread. At 11 a.m., I requested a private meeting. Jonathan's hesitation was almost comical. He had no idea how deep the trap had been laid. We need to discuss the inconsistencies in your recent reports, I said calmly, sliding the first envelope toward him. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he picked it up. Every detail he had tried to conceal was now undeniable. Falsified contracts, hidden accounts, and manipulations carefully documented. The mystery that had haunted him for weeks was now fully exposed. By 1 p.m., Lauren and Diane arrived, each ready to confront him with personal accounts of his betrayals. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jonathan tried to maintain control, speaking sharply, attempting to justify his actions, but his words faltered under the weight of evidence. The stakes were crushing him, and the suspense in the room made it nearly unbearable to watch. Every silence, every pause in his argument, felt like a hammer striking at his carefully constructed image. At 3 p.m., I watched as he realized the depth of his isolation. Former allies whispered behind his back, phone calls were ignored, and the truth I had revealed became impossible to deny. Marcus leaned in quietly and said, "It's over, Jonathan. You can't escape this." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Every move I had orchestrated, the subtle leaks, the planted doubts, the timed revelations, was culminating in this single moment of reckoning. By 5 p.m., Jonathan's facade was gone. The man who had once commanded respect now trembled with uncertainty, unable to navigate the maze of consequences I had created. Diane and Lauren stood strong, their voices unwavering, recounting the betrayals, the lies, and the damage caused. Every word was a strike, and every pause a reminder that his silence had failed to protect him. As night fell, 8 p.m., I left the office quietly, the city lights casting long shadows over the streets below. The final confrontation was imminent. Jonathan would soon face the ultimate consequence, and the suspense, the mystery of how I had orchestrated everything, would finally unravel in front of everyone. My revenge, carefully plotted, meticulously timed, and silently executed, was moments away from complete fulfillment. The morning of day 11 dawned crisp and cold in New York City, 6:30 a.m., the perfect backdrop for the storm I had been orchestrating for weeks. Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse, the skyline glittering behind him, oblivious that his empire of deceit was moments from collapse. The $492,000 that had vanished under his schemes was quietly returning, every transaction traced and secured, while his reputation teetered on the edge of ruin. Diane and Marcus were already in position, the final pieces of the puzzle waiting to fall into place. The conflict that had simmered for weeks would explode today, and the stakes, his fortune, his career, his pride, were higher than ever. By 9 a.m., the office was buzzing with an unusual energy. I arrived under the guise of a routine audit, carrying the final evidence of Jonathan's betrayal. He glanced at me nervously, the first cracks appearing in his mask of composure. I don't understand what this is about," he stammered. I smiled faintly, the calm before the storm, and slid the first folder across the desk. It contained not only financial proofs, but also personal records that exposed every lie he had told to manipulate everyone around him. The suspense was unbearable, every second stretched as if time itself waited for his downfall. By 11:30 a.m., Diane, Lauren, and Marcus entered the room. The tension was palpable. Jonathan's attempts to deflect and justify his actions were feeble against the overwhelming weight of evidence. His silence, once a shield, was now a confession, each pause in his words a testament to the inevitability of what was coming. I revealed how every detail had been tracked, every misstep recorded, and every lie documented. The mystery of my actions, the subtle manipulations, the hidden planning, the quiet patience, now became fully visible, crushing him under the inevitability of justice. By 2 p.m., the fallout had begun. His board members, allies, and even his family confronted him, each betrayal recounted, each lie exposed. The stakes he had ignored for so long now struck with relentless precision. Jonathan's eyes widened in disbelief. The empire he thought was untouchable was crumbling. Every asset, every relationship, every shred of pride was slipping through his fingers, while the people he had wronged stood strong and vindicated. By 5 p.m., Jonathan was left with nothing but silence, his once commanding presence reduced to desperation. I finally spoke, calm and resolute. "Everyone waited for your smiles, your charm, but your silence couldn't hide the truth. And now neither can you hide the consequences." The room seemed to pause, the weight of years of deception finally crashing down. Diane, Lauren, and Marcus had their revenge too, but it was mine that had orchestrated this symphony of justice. By 8 p.m., as the city lights blinked outside, Jonathan was escorted from his office. The financial recovery was complete, the $492,000 safely back in its rightful place, and the board of directors had already begun restructuring. I watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling over me. The suspense, the tension, the stakes all had led to this final revelation. My revenge was complete, silent but undeniable, and the mystery of how I had achieved it would remain a story whispered among those who had witnessed it. The night ended with a final reflection. Revenge, when executed with patience, precision, and unwavering resolve, was not just about justice, it was about reclaiming peace. And now, as I walked through the quiet streets of New York, I knew the balance had been restored, the wrongs righted, and my silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. As I walked through the quiet streets of New York, a sense of peace settled over me. The city buzzed on, unaware of the quiet storm that had passed, and I finally allowed myself a small, victorious smile. Revenge had been patient, precise, and silent, but its impact was undeniable. Now, dear listener, I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced someone who betrayed you and longed for justice? Or maybe you've been in a situation where patience and strategy were your only allies. Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story gripped your heart, made you gasp, or left you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I post stories like this every day, full of suspense, emotion, and twists that you won't see coming. Your experiences, thoughts, and feelings matter here. Let's keep the conversation going. Which part shocked you the most? Which character did you secretly root for? Comment below. I can't wait to read your reactions.